The phone rang at the most unexpected moment. I was stuck in traffic, the radio playing faintly in the background, when my husband's voice broke through the monotony. Dad isn't doing well, you can stop by his place. I'll get there later. His tone was so cold, so distant, as if he were simply fulfilling an obligation. I hung up, but my mind didn't clear. Instead, a knot formed in my stomach. Then, a second message arrived. This time, it was from my father-in-law. I could barely make out his words through his labored breathing, but his plea was clear. "Lorena, help me." Without a second thought, I left my car on the curb and sprinted down a narrow street lined with old trees. The wind was strong, yet I barely felt it. My heart was racing. When I reached his door, it was slightly ajar. Stepping inside, I found him on the floor, barely breathing. His face a mix of pain and resignation. "What happened?" My voice cracked, more from shock than exhaustion. I tried to lift him, but I didn't have the strength. He could only mutter a soft thank you, as I struggled to compose myself. It wasn't the first time I'd seen him vulnerable, but this time felt different. The urgency of the moment filled the air. Yet there was something else, something I couldn't quite pinpoint that made my skin crawl. I helped him onto the couch, and as I did, our eyes met for what felt like an eternity. There was something in his gaze I didn't understand then, but it left me uneasy, a feeling that lingered even after I returned home that night. That single moment, that simple cry for help, marked the beginning of something that would change my life forever. Over time, my visits to my father-in-law's house became more frequent. Each evening after work, I'd arrive at the old home that had begun to feel like a second sanctuary. Often, I'd find him sitting in his armchair, the TV on but ignored, as if it were merely background noise. There was something about the atmosphere of the place, a calmness that contrasted sharply with the chaos of my daily life. One afternoon, after finishing preparing dinner for him, I headed toward the door to leave. I had already started saying goodbye when he called out to me from the chair. "Lorena," he said softly, almost shyly. "Thank you for everything you've done for me. I don't know what I'd do without you." I froze. There was something in his tone, something that made me turn back and approach him again. I sat beside him, thinking he just wanted to express gratitude once more. But his gaze was different, as if he wanted to say more. In an unexpected gesture, he took my hand in his, something he'd never done before. "Your husband is a lucky man," he murmured. And then, suddenly, he leaned toward me. I felt the warmth of his face nearing mine. Before I could process it, his lips brushed against mine for a fleeting second. I pulled away immediately, completely bewildered. "No, we shouldn't," I stammered, unable to find the right words. He simply nodded, his expression revealing both regret and desire. I left in a rush, my mind spinning endlessly, unable to comprehend what had just happened. After that incident, I couldn't stop replaying it in my head. I tried to dismiss it, convincing myself it was just a misunderstanding, a momentary lapse in judgment. But something had shifted. Visiting my father-in-law's house no longer felt the same. Every time I arrived, I sensed a tension in the air, an invisible barrier neither of us wanted to cross. Meanwhile, at home, things continued to crumble slowly. My husband was more absent than ever, consumed by work and his own worries. On the rare occasions we were together, our conversations were brief and mechanical. "How's Dad doing?" He'd ask without looking up from his computer or phone. "Better, seems like he's recovering," I'd respond. But deep down, I knew I wasn't just talking about his physical health. Spending time with my father-in-law wasn't just an obligation anymore. It had become an escape, a routine where I felt appreciated. One night, I finally broke the silence that had settled between us. "Do you realize we hardly talk anymore? It feels like we're living separate lives, as if we're no longer a couple." My voice came out more desperate than I intended. He looked up, surprised by my comment, but his response was cold, almost indifferent. "I've been really busy, Lorena. I don't have time for this right now." Then he turned back to his screen. His words hit me like a slap. It wasn't just what he said, it was the tone, the disinterest in his eyes. I realized I had lost something essential in our marriage, something I no longer knew how to reclaim. At my father-in-law's house, however, things felt different. Though the air was charged with a strange mix of emotions, there was at least a connection. He looked at me in a way that made me feel seen, something I hadn't experienced with my husband in a long time. This only confused me further. I knew I was playing with fire, that what had happened shouldn't happen again. But the emptiness I felt at home kept pulling me back to that dangerous territory over and over. Every time I saw my husband so absorbed in his work, so detached from what was happening in our lives, I felt lonelier. And in that loneliness, I found solace in the small moments spent in that dusty old house where time seemed to stand still and the lines between right and wrong began to blur. One afternoon, arriving at my father-in-law's house, I found him standing next to a toolbox, something I'd never seen during all the time I'd spent caring for him. "What are you doing?" I asked with a smile, surprised to see him out of his usual chair. "I thought about fixing some things around here. The place needs it, and well, it's my way of thanking you for everything you've done." His voice was livelier than it had been in weeks. I didn't know how to respond. Seeing him so active brought back a sense of normalcy that had been missing for a while. I offered to help, and together we began moving old dusty items that had accumulated years of neglect. After a while, we were choosing paint colors for one of the rooms. He seemed interested in every detail, as if clinging to this small renovation as a symbol of something greater. As we painted one of the walls, he asked, "Have you noticed how much you've done for me, Lorena? Without you, I don't know how I would have kept going. You're my only companion these days." His comment left a lump in my throat, not just because of the words, but because of the sincerity behind them. I tried to change the subject, but he wouldn't let me. "No, seriously, what we have is special. You know that, right?" My heart raced. "No, we shouldn't talk about that," I replied, trying to downplay it. "But you know it," he insisted, his gaze locked on mine. "You know this is more than just a relationship between a son-in-law and daughter-in-law. We've been through a lot together." His words echoed in my mind as we continued painting in silence. It was as if each brushstroke carried another layer of tension. I knew I should leave, but I couldn't abandon the project halfway. My excuse felt as fragile as the wall we were covering with fresh paint. Finally, as we finished, it grew late, and I prepared to leave. He walked me to the door, and just as I was about to turn the handle, his hand brushed against mine. It was a soft, almost imperceptible gesture, but it left me frozen for a moment. It wasn't like last time. It wasn't impulsive. This time, his touch was more intimate, more deliberate. "Lorena," he murmured. The way he said my name made everything inside me stop for a second. "We really shouldn't," I tried to say, but couldn't finish the sentence. There were no words that could stop what happened next. A few days passed before I returned to my father-in-law's house. I knew I was stepping into dangerous territory, but every time I tried to avoid thinking about it, an inexplicable force pulled me back. The renovation project was my perfect excuse. "It's just work," I repeated to myself over and over, trying to convince myself that nothing had changed. That afternoon, when I arrived, the atmosphere in the house felt different. The air was heavy, not from the heat or the dust floating in the rooms, but from an invisible tension I hadn't felt before. My father-in-law was sitting in the dining room, flipping through old photos. He greeted me with a smile, but something in his gaze made me feel like we both knew what was coming. "Are you still working on the painting?" he asked, casually, though I saw a depth in his eyes I couldn't ignore. "Yes, I want to finish the living room wall," I replied, trying to sound natural. As we walked toward the living room, the silence between us grew thicker. I knew the moment was near. I knew this silence wasn't just discomfort. It was the prelude to something more. We began working in the living room, each on our side, without speaking for a long time. Occasionally, our arms brushed as we moved furniture, but neither of us commented. The silence was deafening. Then, after we had made significant progress, I paused for a moment, tired from the effort. He did the same, and for an instant, we simply stood facing each other, silent. "Lorena," he began, in a low voice. I turned to him, but couldn't hold his gaze for long. I knew what was coming. "You know we can't keep pretending," he continued, taking a step toward me. "Please, let's not go down this path," I whispered. Though my words lacked conviction, inside I was torn between what I knew I should do and what I had inadvertently started to feel. He took another step, and before I could process it, he was beside me. There were no words, no excuses. What happened next was as unexpected as it was inevitable. He slowly leaned in, and in an almost imperceptible movement, his lips touched mine. It wasn't like the first time. It wasn't impulsive or clumsy. This time, it was different. There was a pause, a brief moment where time seemed to stop. It was a kiss that needed no explanation or prolonging, because we both knew we had crossed a line we couldn't uncross. I pulled away instantly. My hands trembled, but I said nothing, neither did he. The silence that surrounded us was no longer the same as before. Now it was filled with something we couldn't or didn't want to undo. We stood there, motionless, looking at each other, aware that everything had changed in that instant. Without another word, I gathered my things and left, knowing I would never be the same again. After that day, my life became filled with uncomfortable silences and scattered thoughts. I knew I had made a mistake, that what had happened shouldn't have. I tried to convince myself I could ignore it, leave it behind, but it was impossible. Every thought returned to that moment in the living room, to the kiss that had changed everything. I tried to go on with my routine, pretending nothing had happened, but the weight of guilt grew heavier with each passing day. Visits to my father-in-law's house became even tenser. Every time I crossed the threshold, I felt a strange mix of discomfort and anticipation. He was always there, waiting for me. But we never mentioned what had happened. It was as if we had silently agreed to leave that moment in the past, even though we both knew we couldn't. Every conversation, every glance, was loaded with unspoken words. One day, upon arriving, I found him in the kitchen, making coffee. His face seemed calmer than usual, as if he had made peace with what had transpired. I, on the other hand, couldn't find that calm. I approached slowly, trying to pretend everything was fine. "Coffee?" he asked with a smile, as if nothing had changed between us. "Yes, thank you," I replied. But my mind was racing, trying to figure out how I should act, how I could avoid making the situation even more uncomfortable than it already was. We sat at the table, each of us with our cup of coffee. The silence between us was suffocating. Every sip felt like it lasted an eternity. I couldn't bring myself to look him in the eye, not after everything that had happened. Yet, at the same time, a part of me longed for his gaze, for his approval, his forgiveness. "Lorena," he finally said, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, but firm. "We can't keep going like this." I felt my heart race. I wasn't ready for this conversation. I didn't know what to say. "I don't know what that was," I responded, unable to hide my confusion. "I don't know what we're doing." "Neither do I," he admitted, staring at his cup as if searching for the right words. "But I do know we can't pretend nothing happened. And I know that what happened, it wasn't a mistake." His words hit me hard. Wasn't it a mistake? For me, it was the exact opposite. But deep down, I knew he was right. There was something more between us, something neither of us had wanted to admit until now. It wasn't just the kiss, it was everything that had been quietly building between us over weeks, months, maybe even longer. "This isn't right," I said finally, looking up and meeting his eyes, for the first time in what felt like forever. "We can't do this to my husband. We can't keep going down this path." He heard me, but he didn't seem convinced. "I know," he said, "but I can't ignore what I feel, and I know you can't either." We fell silent again, both of us aware that the situation was unsustainable. We knew that sooner or later, the truth would come out, and the consequences would be devastating. But in that moment, neither of us was ready to make a decision. The day I had been dreading finally arrived. After weeks of living in constant tension, trying to ignore the inevitable, my husband began to notice the changes. Though he had never paid much attention to the details of our relationship, something about my behavior made him suspicious this time. Maybe it was my constant absence from home, or the way I avoided his questions whenever he tried to talk to me. Whatever it was, his gaze had become sharper, as if he were searching for answers he didn't know how to put into words. One night, after a long visit to his father's house, I came home to find him sitting on the couch, phone in hand, staring at me intently. The TV was on, but he wasn't watching it. I froze in the doorway, surprised to see him there since he usually stayed out late for work. Something in his expression sent a pang of panic through me. "Lorena," he said. His voice was calm, but carried an undertone I couldn't quite place. "Can we talk?" My heart began pounding. I felt everything I had been trying to avoid was about to come crashing down. I approached slowly, unsure of how to handle what was coming. "What is it?" I asked, trying to maintain my composure. "Something's wrong," he said bluntly. "Lately, you've seemed distant. You're not the same, and I'm not stupid. I know something's going on." His words felt like the ground beneath me was crumbling. I scrambled to think of an excuse, some explanation that might calm him down. But there was none. There was no way to disguise the truth without it becoming obvious. "What are you talking about?" I replied, though I knew my attempt to deflect wasn't going to work. He knew me well enough to tell when I was lying. "Have you been seeing someone else?" he asked, directly. His tone wasn't aggressive, but the pain in his eyes was unmistakable. I remained silent, unable to answer immediately. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to deny it, to pretend everything was fine and that he was just imagining things. But another part of me knew that, deep down, I had already lost him. He no longer trusted me, and that was something no amount of words could fix. "It's complicated," I murmured finally, feeling my voice crack. He let out a long sigh, as if he had already known what I was going to say. "I didn't expect this answer," he said, his sadness cutting through me. "I just wanted to hear it from you. I wanted to give you the chance to be honest." Tears began to fill my eyes. I knew everything was about to fall apart, that there was no going back. It wasn't planned. I tried to explain, though I didn't even know how to justify what had happened. I didn't want it to happen, but it did. He finished the sentence for me. Then he stood up and walked toward the window, turning his back to me. The silence that followed was unbearable. I knew he was processing everything, but I didn't know whether I should say something or just wait. After what felt like an eternity, he turned back to face me. "Is it my father?" he asked, his tone so calm that for a moment, I thought I hadn't heard him correctly. My heart stopped. I couldn't believe he had guessed, that somehow he knew the truth, without me ever saying it aloud. I didn't respond immediately. But my silence was enough to confirm his fears. "I've known something strange was going on between you two," he continued. His voice was still calm, though his eyes reflected a mix of disbelief and betrayal. "I noticed it a while ago, but I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to think you could do something like this to me, that he would." I couldn't hold back the tears any longer. "I'm sorry," I whispered, knowing those words weren't enough, that they would never be enough. He closed his eyes for a moment, as if trying to process the pain he was feeling. "I don't know how we got here, Lorena. I don't know when everything fell apart, but this can't be fixed, can it?" "I don't know," I admitted, feeling completely powerless. I didn't understand how we had let everything collapse like this, but I knew he was right. There was no turning back. "I'm going to stay at a friend's place for a while," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I need space. I don't know what I'll do next, but I can't stay here. I watched him silently gather his things, and in that moment, I knew I had lost him. Everything we had built together, our home, our life, was crumbling before my eyes, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. When he walked out the door, I was left alone in the silence, fully aware that my life would never be the same again. The silence in my father-in-law's house was heavier than usual. The walls seemed to absorb every sound, every unspoken thought between us. I knew this visit would be different, that I couldn't keep delaying the inevitable. For weeks, I had tried to ignore what I was feeling, what had happened between us, but there was no going back now. Not after all the damage we had caused. When I arrived, he was waiting for me, in the same armchair, the same spot where everything had begun. There were no smiles, no familiar gestures, just resigned looks. I approached slowly, feeling the weight of our actions pressing down on me. I knew this would be the last time. "Lorena," he began, his voice tired, "we can't keep going like this." "No," I replied, without hesitation. "This has to end. We've gone too far." We fell silent for a moment, both lost in our thoughts. I could feel every unspoken word piling up between us, making the air thicker, harder to breathe. "I'm sorry," he said suddenly, in a tone I didn't expect. "For everything, I never wanted things to get to this point." His apology hit me with unexpected force. I knew he had been the one to take the first step, but I also knew I had followed. There were no innocents here. We had both fallen into the same mistake. "It's not just you," I said softly. "I let it happen too. We both crossed a line we shouldn't have." His eyes, filled with regret, met mine, and for a moment, all the chaos and confusion seemed to fade away. But the calm only lasted an instant. "My son," he said. "He knows, doesn't he?" He asked the question, though he already knew the answer. His voice was heavy with guilt, not just for what we had done, but for what it meant for his relationship with his own son. I nodded, unable to say more. I knew this revelation weighed on him as much as it did on me, if not more. His family ties were at stake, and whatever we had shared had no future. "I think it's best if we don't see each other again," I said finally, feeling each word tear me apart inside. It wasn't just the need to end our forbidden relationship. It was accepting that we had reached a point of no return. "Maybe you're right," he murmured, avoiding my gaze. But there was something else in his voice, something that made me pause. "What is it?" I asked, though I feared the answer. The silence that followed was unbearable. Finally, he looked up and met my eyes with an intensity I hadn't seen before. "Lorena, there's something I haven't told you." My heart skipped a beat. Something in his tone put me on edge. "What is it?" I insisted, my voice trembling more than I would have liked. He took a slow breath, as if gathering the courage to speak. "Your husband, he knows more than you think." It wasn't by accident that he found out. A lump formed in my throat. "What do you mean?" I asked, unsure if I really wanted to know the answer. "He's known for much longer than you imagine. And worse, he told me before you even suspected anything." The world seemed to stop for a second. The words hung in the air, and I couldn't process them immediately. My mind filled with questions, but none of them led to coherent answers. How was that possible? What did it mean? Why hadn't he told me before? "Why didn't you mention this?" I whispered, feeling betrayal seep into every word. "Because I thought if you knew you'd leave. I thought what we had wouldn't survive if you realized he was playing his own game." It felt like reality was crumbling around me. Everything I thought I knew became irrelevant, in an instant. Had my husband known everything from the start? Had he allowed this to happen for reasons I still didn't understand? But why? I asked, finally, feeling the abyss open beneath my feet. Why would he do something like that? He stood up slowly, his gaze fixed on mine, but there were no answers in his eyes. Only more questions, more uncertainty. "That's something you'll have to figure out for yourself." I left his house with more doubts than when I had arrived. Had my husband allowed it, why hadn't he confronted me directly? The pieces didn't fit together. As the cold evening wind wrapped around me, I knew my life would never be the same again.